Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a business valuation expert in St. Louis, Missouri. During this episode, we will discuss litigation and arbitration or post-acquisition disputes from a CPA and an accounting expert. We have the privilege today to discuss these issues with Scott Stringer, a fellow testifying expert and arbitrator in Naples, Florida. Well, and you kind of bring up a really good point, about post-closing adjustments, because this is the crux of the dispute. But and what I have seen and what we've talked to clients that are going through this process is that at the date that you get an LOI, they say, you provided a balance sheet. So they say here, they know what your working capital was as of that date. It could be 3 to 6 months until you close. During the meantime, I'm kind of advising that they start collecting their receivables, paying off their payables. So working capital is going to go down. But then you have, talk to us about these post-closing adjustments, which are really what people are arguing about. Are these just accounting adjustments, GAAP adjustments, or working capital adjustments, or all of it?
So when I say adjustment, they're adjustments to the purchase price.
Right.
Right. So they're really not adjustments to the books per se. They're really adjustments to the purchase price. So the purchase price is predicated on having $9 million in working capital, and it appears that there's only 7. Okay, so you have an adjustment of the purchase price, and let's say they agree on the 7. So now the purchase price is adjusted by $2 million. Okay,
right.
But then you have disputes as to what those adjustments are, and that's where I get involved.
So talk to us, give us an example of one of the disputes of where they didn't agree to the adjustments.
Okay, so a real common one is where accounts receivable. Accounts receivable are typically stated as that's a subledger, and it has everybody's account in it, and account balance and invoices and such, and that's going to be exactly what you invoiced them. But then there's what they call a contra account that is maintained, because in a perfect world, everybody would pay their bills. In the real world, not everybody pays their bills.
Right.
Allowance for doubtful accounts, it's called, and that is a subjective determination by a company as to what percentage of, or what percentage or what amount of the existing accounts receivables they believe is collectible. There's lots of formulas. There's lots of right ways to do it, and the matter is being consistent in doing it. Companies will look at their historical performance. They'll look at their specific customer makeup. Do we have risky customers? Sometimes they'll do it on a macro basis. Everything 90 days and over is going to be we're going to fully reserve for that. They use the word reserve, or we're going to do 50% of whatever. Sometimes they'll do it on a macro basis. In post-acquisition disputes, they tend to bear down. They should bear down a little bit more and maybe look at specific customer accounts, particularly if they don't have thousands of customers. Right? If they have a smaller sample set where 3 customers make up 40% or 50% of their accounts receivable, they probably should be looking at those customers and their businesses and their history and so on and so forth. So the seller will make a representation to that, because again, even though the buyer can come in and kick the tires and look at the books and do all those other things, until they give the keys of the car to the buyer, right? The seller is in charge of that thing. So the seller, a lot of times a dispute will be, the buyer will say, you know what, these receivables stink. You had a 30% reserve. We have followed up with these customers. We've done our own internal due diligence now that we're driving a car, and we believe that the allowance is $1 million understated, and therefore we are proposing $1 million decrease in the purchase price. And so that is a very, very, very typical type of dispute that would come before a CPA arbitrator.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's the other ones. A lot of them are, and again, that is an example of generally accepted accounting principles, but it's a subjective analysis, right? There's other issues about deferred revenue, where you, in essence, you've been paid, you've already been paid for something you're gonna have to perform later. A lot of times those are in license agreements, etc. The buyer wants more of that recognized in advance, because the buyer basically doesn't want to have to recognize income on money that's already been paid.
Right.
So there are many ways to do this correctly, and a lot of complex. When I get hired, it's usually not very clear, right? So if it was really clear, they wouldn't need me. So the one I did, for example, was two international companies who had multiple master license holders, who then had sub license holders and territory holders. And when licenses got recognized was a matter of art and application of not only generally accepted accounting principles, but IFRS, and had been done that way for a number of years. In different countries, they did it different ways, and so on and so forth. But in essence, they came up with a way that did it that was really in compliance with what we consider to be GAAP. The buyer disagreed with the way that GAAP was performed, right? The buyer disagreed with that. And as a result, and I was actually the arbitrator on this, threw tons of GAAP and IFRS issues at me that were true, but so was the other side, because under GAAP and IFRS, when these issues came up, you could do it either way. It really depended on some subjective decision making about when did the users use it, et cetera. The point to this is that what Wade, once I took the evidence and looked at it on both hands, you go back to the stock purchase agreement and asset purchase agreement, which says GAAP as consistently applied. So you can go through all of this analysis, and that you still have to, if one side has represented, I've done GAAP, but it's not GAAP, then that's one thing. Then you would have to say, well, we don't care how you've done it in the past. You didn't do it according to GAAP. So I had to go in and basically say, while maybe your GAAP seems good, and maybe it even is better than their GAAP, they're still GAAP, and you agreed in the stock purchase agreement and the asset purchase agreement, whatever it was, you agreed how GAAP was consistently applied. You agreed to those terms. So the burden there is to prove that something was not done in accordance with GAAP when it was represented that it was done in accordance with GAAP. And so these are the really interesting parts of my job, is to be able to look at those. And yeah, when we get those kind of things, I have to bring experts on my team who know lots about GAAP and in specific areas, in specific industries too.